The rain fell in sheets across the Philippine jungle, turning the red clay beneath Sergeant James Sullivan's boots into something like blood. He crouched behind the twisted roots of a mahogany tree, his M1 Garand clutched against his chest, the metal cold even in the tropical heat. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. But here, in this pocket of green hell, there was only the sound of water hitting leaves and his own ragged breathing. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The rifle felt different in his hands now. Heavier. Not in weight but in meaning. 3 days ago, he'd watched Private Tommy Chen take apart his Garand with the kind of reverence other men reserved for prayer. Tommy's fingers had moved across the operating rod, the trigger assembly, the end-block clip with a tenderness that seemed almost inappropriate for an instrument of death. "My grandfather was a gunsmith in San Francisco," Tommy had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He taught me that every tool has a soul. You treat it right, it treats you right." Sullivan hadn't believed in souls back then. Not for rifles, anyway. Not for anything if he was being honest with himself. But that was before the ambush at the river crossing. Before he'd seen what the Garand could do in the right hands, and what it represented in the wrong story. The firebase was called Firebase Redemption, though nobody could remember who'd given it that name. It sat on a ridge overlooking the Candaba Swamp, a collection of sandbag bunkers and muddy foxholes that housed what remained of Baker Company. 53 men when they'd arrived 2 months ago. 31 now. The jungle didn't discriminate. It took Americans and Japanese alike, swallowed them whole in green silence. Lieutenant Marcus Thornton stood at the edge of the command post, studying a map that had been drawn and redrawn so many times the paper was more tape than pulp. He was 24 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards. A philosophy major from Cornell who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, Thornton had a habit of quoting Kipling at inappropriate moments and keeping a battered copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius in his pack. "Sullivan," Thornton called out, not looking up from his map. "You've got patrol in 20. Take Chen and Rodriguez. Standard recon, 2 clicks north. Check the old plantation road." Sullivan nodded, water streaming from the brim of his helmet. He started to rise, then hesitated. "Lieutenant, about what happened yesterday. We'll discuss it when you get back." Thornton's voice was clipped, professional. But Sullivan caught the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw worked as if he were chewing on words too dangerous to speak aloud. The patrol assembled near the western perimeter. Private First Class Maria Rodriguez was already there, checking her gear with the methodical precision she brought to everything. She'd been a nurse in Houston before the war, had joined the Army Nurse Corps and then somehow ended up here, one of the few women attached to frontline units for medical support. Her Garand looked enormous in her small hands, but Sullivan had seen her qualify expert on the range. "Ready when you are, Sarge," she said. Tommy Chen emerged from his foxhole, his rifle slung across his back. At 19, he was the youngest in the squad, baby-faced and earnest in a way that made older soldiers either want to protect him or avoid him entirely. Bad luck, they said, to get too attached to the new ones. But Tommy had been with them for 4 months now, which made him practically a veteran. "Heard anything from intelligence?" Rodriguez asked as they moved through the perimeter wire, single file, Sullivan in the lead. "Same as always. Japanese forces regrouping somewhere north. Possible company strength unit. Maybe a battalion." Sullivan kept his voice low. In the jungle, sound traveled in strange ways, bouncing off trees and doubling back on itself. "Command thinks they're massing for a counterattack." What he didn't say, what none of them said, was that intelligence was mostly guesswork out here. The Japanese were ghosts in this jungle, appearing and vanishing like smoke. They'd learned to move without sound, to dig tunnels and spider holes that could hide an entire platoon. And they'd learned to hate the Garand with a passion that bordered on religious fervor. The plantation road appeared after 40 minutes of careful movement. It wasn't much, just 2 muddy ruts cutting through the undergrowth, but it had been a major artery once, back when this had been farmland instead of battlefield. An old stone marker stood at the intersection, covered in vines. Spanish words, worn almost smooth. Rodriguez ran her fingers across the letters. Hacienda San Miguel, she translated. This was all sugarcane once. My grandmother used to tell stories about places like this. How the land remembers everything that happens on it. Sullivan was about to respond when Chen held up a fist, the signal for freeze. They all dropped, weapons up, scanning the treeline. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then Sullivan heard it too. Voices speaking Japanese, coming from the north. They'd set up in a small clearing just off the road. Sullivan counted 7 men through his field glasses, maybe 8. Japanese infantry, exhausted-looking, sitting in a rough circle. They weren't on alert. That was the first thing he noticed. The second thing was what they were doing. They were examining a rifle, an M1 Garand. One of the Japanese soldiers held it like it was a live snake, turning it over in his hands. The others leaned in, pointing, arguing in rapid-fire Japanese that Sullivan couldn't follow. But he didn't need to understand the words to catch the tone. Anger, fear, something that sounded almost like awe. The soldier with the Garand stood up, shouldered the weapon, and made a shooting motion. Then he said something that made the others laugh. A bitter, harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. He pantomimed the rifle's semi-automatic action, the rapid fire that made it so deadly. 8 rounds without reloading. 8 rounds while a bolt-action rifle could manage maybe 2. Another soldier produced something from his pack, a piece of paper carefully folded. He opened it, and even from 50 meters away, Sullivan could see it was a propaganda leaflet. Japanese writing, but also a drawing. An American soldier with a demonic face, holding a Garand that looked more like a dragon than a rifle. Tommy Chen had gone very still beside him. His breathing had changed, become shallow and quick. The Japanese soldier with the leaflet began to read aloud. His voice carried across the clearing, rising and falling with a cadence that sounded almost like poetry. Sullivan couldn't understand the words, but he understood the message. He'd seen enough propaganda to recognize its shape, its rhythm. That's when he noticed the pile of equipment beside them. American gear, dog tags, and rifles, at least 3 M1 Garands stacked like cordwood. Sarge, Rodriguez breathed. Those are from 2nd Platoon, from the river crossing. Sullivan's blood went cold. 2nd Platoon had been ambushed 3 days ago. 17 men went in, 4 came out. The rest were listed as missing, presumed dead. But looking at those rifles, those dog tags, Sullivan knew there was no presuming about it. The Japanese soldier finished reading and carefully folded the leaflet. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he raised the Garand above his head and brought it down across his knee. The crack echoed through the clearing. The rifle didn't break, the Garand was built too well for that. But the stock splintered, the barrel bent. The soldier threw it aside with a sound of disgust and reached for another. They're destroying them, Chen whispered. All of them. Sullivan pulled back slowly, motioning for the others to retreat. They'd seen enough, more than enough. But as they slipped back into the jungle, he couldn't shake the image of that Japanese soldier breaking the Garand. Couldn't unhear the sound of wood splintering, metal bending. When they got back to Firebase Redemption, Lieutenant Thornton was waiting with Captain Richard Hayes, the company commander. Hayes was a career officer, regular Army from before the war, with gray at his temples and a service record that stretched back to the Pancho Villa expedition. He stood ramrod straight despite the mud and heat, his uniform somehow still crisp. "Report," Hayes said. Sullivan told them everything. The Japanese patrol, the captured Garands, the propaganda leaflets, the deliberate destruction of American weapons. When he finished, Hayes and Thornton exchanged a look that Sullivan couldn't quite read. "This is the 3rd report like this in 2 weeks," Hayes said finally. "Intelligence has been tracking a pattern. The Japanese aren't just fighting us anymore. They're fighting our weapons, specifically the M1. Thornton unrolled a map on the hood of a jeep. Red circles marked locations across the Philippine archipelago. Every one of these is a site where we've found destroyed Garands. Not captured, destroyed. Broken, burned, sometimes buried. The Japanese are going out of their way to eliminate these rifles, even when it would be tactically smarter to take them as trophies or use them. Why? Rodriguez asked. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Because General MacArthur called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. And the Japanese heard him. Sullivan felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't just about weapons anymore. It was about symbols. About what the Garand represented. There's something else, Thornton said quietly. He pulled a folder from his pack, opened it to reveal more leaflets, these ones in English. These are being distributed to Japanese troops. We found them on prisoners. They're instructions, essentially. How to recognize American units by the sound of their rifles. How to count rounds in a Garand's clip. How to use the ping of an empty clip to time attacks. He spread the leaflets out. They were sophisticated, detailed, almost scientific in their analysis of the M1 Garand. Diagrams showed the rifle's internals. Charts compared its rate of fire to Japanese Type 38 and Type 99 rifles. But woven through the technical information was something else. Propaganda that painted the Garand not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of American industrial might, American arrogance, American imperialism. They're teaching their soldiers to fear it, Sullivan said slowly, and to hate it. More than that, Hayes replied. They're teaching them that defeating the Garand is the same as defeating America. That every rifle destroyed is a moral victory. Tommy Chen had been silent through all this. Now he spoke up, his voice tight. My uncle fought in China. Before we came here, he wrote letters about Japanese propaganda. How they twisted everything. Made their enemies into monsters. He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his own Garand. But they're doing the same thing with us now, aren't they? We say our rifle is the greatest weapon ever made. They say it's a tool of demons. Both sides turning machines into mythology. The rain had stopped, but the jungle still dripped, water falling from leaves like 1,000 small drums. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, one of those sounds that could be either natural or human, impossible to tell in this place where everything familiar became strange. Captain Hayes rolled up the map. Battalion wants a full intelligence assessment. They're sending a specialist, some academic they pulled from strategic services. He'll be here tomorrow to interview everyone who's encountered this phenomenon. Phenomenon, Rodriguez repeated. That's what we're calling it now? That's what it is, Thornton said. A psychological operation targeting our primary infantry weapon. If the Japanese can make their soldiers believe the Garand is beatable, or worse, make our soldiers doubt it, they've won something more valuable than ground. Sullivan thought about the Japanese soldier breaking that rifle across his knee. The way the others had watched. Their faces lit with something that looked like savage joy. And he thought about Tommy Chen's fingers moving across his own Garand with tenderness. With belief. Two mythologies. Colliding in the mud and rain of a Philippine jungle. That night, Sullivan couldn't sleep. He sat in his foxhole, cleaning his Garand by the light of a hooded flashlight. The routine was meditative. Field strip, wipe down each component, check for rust, reassemble. He'd done it 1,000 times, could do it blindfolded. But tonight, every piece felt different in his hands. The trigger housing group, the hammer, the bolt, the operating rod that gave the Garand its distinctive action. Each part was a marvel of engineering, designed by a man named John Garand who'd spent years perfecting this weapon. Sullivan had never thought about that before, about the human hands that had created the thing he carried, about the intention behind every curve and angle. Can't sleep either? Tommy Chen appeared at the edge of the foxhole, his own rifle slung over his shoulder. Just thinking. Sullivan set down the trigger assembly. About what you said earlier. Mythology. Chen slid into the foxhole, keeping low. My grandfather used to say that humans can't help it. We make stories out of everything. Even things that are just things. The Garand isn't just a thing, though. Not anymore. Sullivan gestured at the rifle between them. MacArthur made sure of that when he called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. He turned it into a symbol. And symbols have power, Chen finished. Yeah, the Japanese understand that. Maybe better than we do. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the jungle's night sounds. Finally, Chen spoke again. My family's been in America for 3 generations. But when the war started, there were people who looked at me and only saw the enemy. They couldn't see past what I looked like to who I actually was. He paused. I think that's what's happening here, too. Both sides looking at metal and wood and seeing everything except what it actually is. Sullivan thought about the propaganda leaflets. The demonic American soldier with his dragon rifle. The Japanese instructions to fear and hate the M1. And he thought about MacArthur's words, the pride they were supposed to instill, the superiority they implied. So what is it actually? He asked. Strip away all the stories, all the meaning we've poured into it. What's the Garand actually? Chen picked up Sullivan's rifle, felt its weight. A tool. Well-designed, reliable, effective. Nothing more. Nothing less. He handed it back. But nobody fights a war with just tools, do they? We need the stories. We need to believe our rifle is blessed and theirs is cursed. We need mythology to make the killing bearable. It was the most honest thing Sullivan had heard since landing in the Philippines. And the most troubling. Because if Chen was right, if the Garand was just a tool that both sides had wrapped in competing mythologies, then what did that say about everything else? About the reasons they were fighting, the causes they'd been told to believe in, the meanings they'd assigned to this endless green hell? Sullivan looked down at his rifle, at the manufacturer's mark stamped into the receiver. Springfield Armory, 1943. Made by American workers in an American factory. Designed by a Canadian immigrant who'd become a citizen and dedicated his life to this single creation. The Garand was real, solid, undeniable in its existence. But the story of the Garand, MacArthur's story, the Japanese propaganda story, even John Garand's own story of perfectionist dedication, those were human creations. As malleable as clay, as changeable as weather. Tomorrow, Chen said, standing to leave. When that specialist comes to interview us, what are you going to tell him? Sullivan didn't answer right away. He reassembled his rifle, feeling each piece click into place with satisfying precision. When it was complete, he worked the action once, heard the smooth sound of American engineering at its finest. I'm going to tell him the truth, he said finally. That the Japanese are right to fear this rifle, and that we're wrong to think that's all there is to it. Chen nodded slowly, then disappeared into the darkness, leaving Sullivan alone with his weapon and his thoughts. The rain started again just before dawn. Sullivan listened to it drum against his helmet and wondered what stories the Japanese soldiers were telling themselves in their own foxholes, what meanings they were finding in the sound of water on steel. Somewhere out there, in the vast green darkness, men were preparing to kill each other over a piece of machinery that neither side truly understood. They would fight with rifles, yes, but also with narratives, with mythologies, with competing visions of what their weapons meant and what their deaths would signify. And Sullivan, sitting in the mud of Firebase Redemption with his M1 Garand across his knees, understood for the first time that he was fighting 2 wars. One was against the Japanese Empire. The other was against the stories both sides kept telling themselves. He wasn't sure which war would be harder to win. James Sullivan had been a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon before the war. Every morning at 7:15, he'd stand at the front of his classroom in Roosevelt High School, writing the day's topic on the blackboard in careful cursive. The French Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, the causes of the First World War. His students, 16 and 17-year-olds who thought themselves immortal, would slouch in their seats and pretend not to care while he spoke about dead men and distant battles. Mr. Sullivan, a girl named Dorothy Marsh had asked one afternoon in the spring of 1941, "Why do we have to learn about wars? They're all the same, aren't they? People fight, people die, nothing changes." He'd stopped mid-sentence, chalk hovering over the blackboard. For a moment, he'd genuinely considered the question. Then he'd turned to face her, to face all of them. Wars are never the same, Dorothy. The weapons change. The tactics change. But more importantly, the stories we tell about them change. And those stories, those narratives we construct, they shape everything that comes after. Dorothy had rolled her eyes. The other students had gone back to their notebooks. And Sullivan had returned to his lecture on Verdun. never imagining that less than a year later, he'd be living inside one of those narratives, trapped in a story that hadn't been written yet. Now, sitting in his foxhole at Firebase Redemption while the specialist from Strategic Services set up his portable desk in the command bunker, Sullivan couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. About Dorothy Marsh and her question. About all the certainty he'd felt standing at that blackboard, speaking about war as if it were something that could be understood from a distance, analyzed like a mathematical equation. Private First Class Maria Rodriguez appeared beside his foxhole, medical kit slung over her shoulder. Captain Hayes wants us assembled in 30 minutes. The specialist is ready to begin interviews. Sullivan looked up at her. Rodriguez was 26, older than most of the enlisted personnel, with dark eyes that carried a weight of experience that had nothing to do with combat. You nervous? About talking to some desk jockey from Washington? She shrugged. I've dealt with worse. Last month, I had to explain to a brigadier general why we couldn't evacuate wounded during a firefight. At least this guy probably won't shoot at me if I say something he doesn't like. But there was tension in her shoulders, in the way she gripped the strap of her medical kit. Sullivan knew the signs. They all carried their own private wars, their own struggles that had nothing to do with the Japanese. Rodriguez, he said carefully, back in Houston, before all this, you ever feel like you were fighting just to exist? She looked at him sharply, then her expression softened. Every day. I was a Mexican woman trying to work in a hospital where half the doctors didn't think I should be touching white patients. I had a nursing degree from a real college, but they wanted to put me in the laundry. She paused. You know what they told me when I enlisted? That the Army needed nurses so badly they were willing to overlook certain characteristics. Like my being Mexican was some kind of handicap they were graciously ignoring. That's why you asked for frontline assignment, Sullivan said. It wasn't a question. I got tired of proving myself in rooms where nobody wanted to see me succeed. Figured out here, in the jungle, all that matters is whether you can do the job. She laughed, but it was bitter. Turns out I was wrong about that too. Even here, I'm still proving myself. Every single day. Tommy Chen joined them, his Garand slung over his shoulder. His baby face looked even younger in the morning light, but his eyes were old. They're calling us in alphabetical order. Chen's up first, apparently. Sullivan watched the younger man's hands. They were steady on his rifle, but there was a tremor in his left thumb, barely visible. A tell that Sullivan had learned to recognize over months of watching soldiers deal with stress. Tommy, he said quietly, you okay? Chen didn't answer right away. He looked out at the jungle, at the green wall that surrounded them on all sides. My parents are in Manzanar, he said finally. Internment camp in California. They put them there because having Japanese ancestry makes them dangerous, apparently. Enemy aliens, that's what the government calls them. Sullivan felt his chest tighten. He'd known Chen's family was in the camps, everyone knew, but the young private rarely spoke about it. So here's the funny thing, Chen continued, his voice eerily calm. My parents are locked up in America because white people think they might be loyal to Japan. And I'm in the Philippines killing Japanese soldiers to prove I'm a real American. And the Japanese soldiers I'm killing, they've been told I'm a demon because I carry a rifle that represents everything they're supposed to hate about America. He turned to look at Sullivan. Tell me, Sarge, which part of that makes any damn sense? Rodriguez reached out, put a hand on Chen's shoulder. None of it makes sense, Tommy. Not a bit of it. But we keep doing it anyway, Chen said. We keep playing our parts in this insane story. Lieutenant Thornton appeared around the corner of the command bunker, his copy of Meditations tucked under one arm. Chun, Sullivan, Rodriguez. The specialist is ready for you. They filed into the bunker, a dim space reinforced with sandbags and timber. The specialist stood as they entered, and Sullivan's first thought was that he looked exactly like what a strategic services academic should look like. Wire-rimmed glasses, neatly pressed uniform that had clearly never seen mud, an earnest expression that suggested he still believed the world could be understood through careful study. Gentlemen, ma'am, the specialist said, extending his hand. I'm Captain David Rothstein, Psychological Operations Division. I appreciate you taking the time. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of soft hands that came from handling books instead of rifles. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, missing nothing as he studied each of them in turn. I understand you've had direct contact with Japanese forces demonstrating unusual behavior regarding captured M1 rifles. Rothstein continued, gesturing for them to sit on the wooden benches that lined the bunker. I'd like to hear about it in your own words. Everything you observed, everything you felt. Sullivan glanced at Chen and Rodriguez. They discussed this briefly before coming in. What to say, what to hold back. But looking at Rothstein's expectant face, Sullivan realized he had no idea how to explain what they'd witnessed. They were destroying them, Chen said abruptly. The Garands, breaking them. It wasn't just tactical, taking weapons from the battlefield. It was ritualistic, like they were killing demons. Rothstein's pen moved across his notepad. Ritualistic. That's an interesting choice of words. What made it seem ritualistic? Chen struggled for a moment. The care they took. One of them read from a propaganda leaflet first like a prayer. Then the breaking. Then they set them aside, arranged them in a specific way. It had structure, purpose beyond just elimination of enemy equipment. And the propaganda materials, Rothstein pressed. You saw them clearly? Clear enough, Sullivan interjected. Japanese text, but also illustrations. American soldiers depicted as monsters. And the Garand, it wasn't drawn like a normal rifle. It looked alive, threatening. Rothstein leaned forward. Sergeant Sullivan, you were a teacher before the war. How would you characterize what you saw? From an analytical standpoint. The question caught Sullivan off guard. How did you? I read all the service files before coming here, Rothstein said simply. You have a master's degree in history. You taught for 7 years. You understand narrative construction, the way stories shape perception. So tell me, what story were those Japanese soldiers telling themselves? Sullivan considered this carefully. Outside, the rain had started again. A steady drumming on the bunker's roof. They were telling themselves that the Garand is more than a weapon. That it represents something larger, American power, American technology, maybe American evil. And by destroying it, they're not just eliminating a tactical advantage. They're striking at the symbol. And what story are we telling ourselves? Rothstein asked quietly. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The question hung in the air like smoke. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably on her bench. Chen's hand went to his rifle, an unconscious gesture of reassurance. We're telling ourselves the Garand makes us superior, Sullivan said finally. That American engineering and American innovation have given us an unbeatable advantage. MacArthur's statement, the greatest battle implement ever devised. It's not just praise. It's doctrine. It's belief. Rothstein nodded slowly. 2 competing mythologies, built around the same object. The Japanese see the Garand as a symbol of everything they're fighting against. We see it as proof of everything we're fighting for. He paused. The question is, which mythology is more dangerous? The one that's wrong, Rodriguez said sharply. And they're both wrong. Rothstein turned to her. Explain. It's a rifle, Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the weight of exhausted frustration. A very good rifle, yes. Reliable, effective, well-designed. But it's not magic. It's not demonic. It's not the physical embodiment of national character or industrial superiority or manifest destiny or whatever the hell else we want to project onto it. She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. I've held dying men while they bled out from wounds that no rifle, no matter how well engineered, could have prevented them from inflicting. I've watched soldiers with Garands fail and soldiers with bolt actions succeed. The mythology on both sides, it's noise. Dangerous noise that makes us all lose sight of what's actually happening. Rothstein wrote furiously. And what is actually happening in your assessment? We're fighting each other, Chen said quietly. That's what's actually happening. Japanese soldiers and American soldiers, killing each other in a jungle that doesn't care about either side's mythology. The Garand is part of it, sure. But it's not the point. It's never been the point. Then what is the point? Rothstein asked. Silence. Because none of them had an answer for that. Or rather, they each had different answers, contradictory answers, answers that couldn't coexist in the same narrative. Sullivan thought about his classroom, about Dorothy Marsh asking why they had to learn about wars. He thought about his parents, Irish immigrants who'd come to America believing in streets paved with gold and found instead streets paved with prejudice and hard labor. He thought about the stories they told him as a child, about the old country and the new one, about what it meant to be American. The point, he said slowly, is that we need to believe we're fighting for something. And the Garand, for us, for them, has become a way to make that belief tangible. It's easier to fight for a rifle you can hold than an abstract principle you can't see. Rothstein set down his pen. Sergeant, I've interviewed 47 soldiers in the last 3 weeks. Officers and enlisted from different units, different backgrounds. And you're the first one to articulate it that clearly. He paused. You're also the first one to sound like you don't entirely believe in the mythology we're constructing. I believe in keeping my men alive, Sullivan said. Everything else is secondary. Even if everything else is what they're willing to die for? It was a cruel question, delivered in a gentle tone. Sullivan felt anger rise in his chest, hot and sudden. But before he could respond, Chen spoke up. Captain Rothstein, why are you here? Really? What strategic services hoping to accomplish with all these interviews? Rothstein looked at the young private for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, but it was sad, almost resigned. The honest answer? I'm not entirely sure. Command sent me to assess the psychological impact of Japanese anti-Garand propaganda, to determine if it's affecting American morale or combat effectiveness, to recommend countermeasures. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief. But the more I talk to soldiers like you, the more I realize we're asking the wrong questions. What are the right questions? Rodriguez asked. How do we fight a war without becoming the myths we create? How do we use symbols without being controlled by them? How do we honor the tools that keep us alive without worshipping them? Rothstein put his glasses back on. Those are the right questions. And I don't think anyone in strategic services or in the entire U.S. military knows how to answer them. Outside, someone shouted an alarm. Distant gunfire rattled through the jungle, sporadic but growing closer. Everyone in the bunker tensed, reached for weapons. Lieutenant Thornton burst through the entrance. Sullivan, get your squad ready. We've got movement on the northern perimeter. Could be a probe, could be a full assault. Either way, we need bodies on the line. Sullivan stood, Chen and Rodriguez immediately following. But Rothstein reached out, touched Sullivan's arm. Sergeant, one more thing. In all your study of history, of wars and their narratives, did you ever find an example of soldiers who fought without mythology? Without stories to justify the violence? Sullivan looked down at the academic's soft hand on his worn, mud-stained sleeve. No, he said quietly. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that we create these mythologies, but that we can't seem to fight without them. Then he was moving, out of the bunker and into the rain, Rodriguez and Chen flanking him as they ran toward their fighting positions. Behind them, he heard Rothstein gathering his papers, preparing to evacuate to a safer location. The academic would survive this, probably, would write his report, would try to quantify and analyze something that defied quantification. But Sullivan and his squad would stay on the line, rifles in hand, living inside the mythology whether they believed in it or not. The firefight lasted 3 hours. It was a probe, just as Thornton had suspected, Japanese forces testing the perimeter, looking for weak points. Sullivan's squad held their section of the line, returning fire with the steady, semi-automatic rhythm of their Garands. 8 rounds, ping, reload. 8 rounds, ping, reload. The sound became a mechanical heartbeat, driving away thought, drowning out questions about mythology and meaning. When it was over, Sullivan counted heads. Everyone accounted for. A few minor wounds. Rodriguez had already moved down the line, applying pressure bandages and dispensing morphine with the calm efficiency that made her invaluable. No casualties. But across the perimeter in 3rd Squad sector they hadn't been so lucky. Sullivan found Lieutenant Thornton in the aftermath, standing over 2 bodies covered with ponchos. The rain had turned the ground around them into red-tinged mud. "Reynolds and Kowalski," Thornton said flatly. "Grenade. They probably didn't feel anything." Sullivan had known both men. Reynolds was from Georgia, had 3 kids and a wife who sent him letters every week filled with news about church socials and Victory Garden harvests. Kowalski was a Polish immigrant from Chicago, had worked in a meatpacking plant before the war, could curse in 4 languages. "They're rifles?" Sullivan asked. Thornton pointed to where 2 M1 Garands leaned against a sandbag wall, covered in mud and blood but otherwise intact. "Functional. We'll redistribute them to replacements when they arrive." Sullivan stared at those rifles. They would outlive the men who'd carried them, would be cleaned, oiled, and handed to new soldiers who would create their own relationships with the weapons, their own private meanings. The Garands would continue, indifferent to the deaths of their users. "Lieutenant," Sullivan said quietly, "that specialist Rothstein, what do you think he's going to put in his report?" Thornton was silent for a moment. Probably something about the need for counterpropaganda, efforts to reinforce positive associations with the M1, maybe recommendations for psychological resilience training. He looked at Sullivan. "But between you and me, I think he's going to say we're all crazy. Both sides. That we've taken a perfectly good rifle and turned it into something it was never meant to be." Would he be wrong? No. Thornton picked up his copy of Meditations, which had somehow survived the firefight tucked in his jacket. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane." I used to think that meant something noble. Now I think it just means we're all trapped in collective madness, and the only escape is death. It was the bleakest thing Sullivan had ever heard Thornton say. The lieutenant usually maintained a facade of philosophical optimism, finding meaning in stoic maxims and ancient wisdom. But standing over the bodies of Reynolds and Kowalski, with the rain washing blood into the Philippine soil, even Thornton's careful construction of meaning seemed to be crumbling. "Get some rest, Sergeant," Thornton said finally. "We've got patrol again tomorrow." Sullivan returned to his foxhole, where Chun was already waiting. The young private had his Garand disassembled on a poncho, cleaning each piece with meticulous care despite the continuing rain. "I keep thinking about my grandfather," Chun said without looking up. "The gunsmith. He used to say that a good weapon is like a good friend, reliable, honest, there when you need it. But he also said you can't love a weapon. Love is for people. Respect is for tools. Smart man, your grandfather. He died last year. Heart attack. In Manzanar." Chen's hands paused over the trigger assembly. "My mother wrote that he was working in the camp's machine shop, fixing things.